There's no one perfect palette that works for everyone, but with the help of this video, you can find a palette that works for you and your situation. Hey everyone, it's Ashley from Art Summits, and as the host of the Watercolor Summit, I've had the opportunity to learn from some really talented artists over the years and find out what their favorite tools and supplies are. Today we're focusing on palettes, but if you're interested in learning more about what tools and supplies your favorite artists use, check out our Watercolor Favorites series. I'll link to it below, where you'll learn even more about palettes, paints, and brushes. As you can see here, there are so many different types of palettes, but I wanted to categorize them by their surface type. So we have metal palettes, plastic, porcelain, disposable, and a special bonus palette that I'm going to tell you about at the end of this video. So let's talk about palettes made of metal. The first one we have is a butcher pan tray, and I've also got some metal travel tins that are specifically made for watercolors. And we have a couple different sizes, small and a medium to large size. What's great about the metal trays in particular is that they are unbreakable. They also don't stain very easily, and they're pretty lightweight, especially this small one. So these are great for traveling. You can even store some brushes in here. They're also interchangeable with the half pans. Now these are half pans. You can also put in full pans, which are double the size basically. But if you get tired of using particular paint colors after a while, you can swap these out. You can purchase empty half pans or full pans online and have them for all of your tube watercolors and just swap them out when you want to try some new colors in your palette. On the negative side, there are a couple things that you may not like about using a metal palette. And in particular with these butcher trays, you can hopefully see that they aren't completely flat. There can be a little bit of a warp to them. So a lot of times that means that your paints, especially if you're using water-based media like watercolor, here I used acrylic and so it was a little bit thicker, but if you're using water-based paints, it will tend to run towards the edges. So if you're using this as a actual storage palette for your paints, you may want to consider putting your paints in the middle instead of along the edges, and then using the edges to be kind of your mixing area, since that's where the paint is going to flow naturally. If you have a palette like this, I mean, check your butcher tray if you get one and make sure it's kind of warped in the same direction, but that's kind of what I've seen. Now, the other drawback about these types of metal trays is that they can stain a little bit, but generally not as much as plastic. So you can see another common problem with metal palettes is that they bead up, and this makes it difficult for mixing colors together. That goes away over time, so I wouldn't recommend necessarily using anything to scratch the surface like a sponge, like a scratchy side of a sponge, because you will scratch the surface of your palette and then it will be more likely to stain. So instead, just keep using it and eventually this beading issue will go away. So I even got some Windex and tried to get this stain off, and it's still not coming off. But that is an issue with metal palettes that you need to be aware of. Now, another issue with metal palettes is that there's not really a happy medium in terms of mixing areas. So you have your paint well areas. Well, here you don't have that at all, but with these palettes, you've got your paint areas, and then your mixing areas are pretty small, especially with this one. But even over here, this might be too small of a mixing area for you. So if you move to something like this, it's a bigger palette, obviously you have a ton of area to mix, but then you don't have individual places to store your paints. Another thing that kind of bugs me about using pans is that sometimes it's difficult to see which color is which. So like we've got these two blues, and because they're all kind of concentrated in one area, they both look really dark. Whereas if they were in a palette like I'm going to show you, one of the ceramic ones or even one of the plastic ones, you would be able to see like a lighter value of those colors and be able to discern which type of blue it is. And last thing, if you use a bigger brush with your watercolors or you work with, large washes, it can be difficult to get inside these little half pans, and over time it can damage your brushes. So you just need to be careful and keep that in mind when using small little half pans for your palettes. So these two are a great option for travel. They have the thumb holes for working plein air, and then this butcher tray they do have in different sizes, so depending on how much room you have on your desk or in your studio, this may be a good option for you as well. Now let's look at plastic palettes. You can see we have quite the variety here. We have a folding palette, we have some small round plastic palettes, as well as oval, some little rectangular ones, a bigger palette with wells, and then the John Pike palette, which actually has a lid as well. The pros of plastic palettes are similar to metal palettes. They are inexpensive, they're unbreakable, and they are lightweight. Probably the biggest drawback is that plastic stains really easily. You can see that here in this palette, where the blues especially tend to stain, and that makes it really difficult when you are trying to mix a color accurately. If you have a stain underneath, it's going to skew your mixing results. I do really like this John Pike palette. I like the fact that it has separate wells for your paints, but also a really large mixing area, and then it also has the lid, so that helps keep dust and fur out. Similar to metal, plastic palettes can also bead up when you first start using them. So again, that's something that changes as you start using them, but you can see here with this palette, which I haven't used that much, it's still beading up pretty badly. This is just a cheapy low Cornell palette that folds up. It doesn't stay closed very well, so be careful with that. You may want to put a rubber band around it. It's got a thumb hole if you wanted to use it for plein air painting or while standing up. These, actually I used gouache and acrylic with these, so they're a bit messy. But these are just like useful maybe if you're working on a project one-off and you just need something separate from your regular palette. Same thing with this little guy. This is handy as well. And if you ever come across a palette like this that is completely flat with no wells and no edge to it, don't use it for watercolor because the water will just run right off. This is more for oil or painting with acrylics. And then last but not least, we have a open well palette similar to the John Pike palette, but it's got fewer large mixing areas and instead of this one big open spot. One more nice thing about this John Pike palette is that the lid can also double as another super large mixing area. So you can see you've got some staining there though, and so that is the number one reason that I have moved to ceramic palettes, which we will talk about next. My favorite type of palette is a ceramic or porcelain palette, and I just love these because they are pure white, so they're great for color mixing, and they don't stain, they don't bead. They are heavier, obviously, and more breakable than metal or plastic, but if you're not going to travel, that's not so much of an issue if it's just sitting on your desk. You can see I've got all kinds of sizes, and some are specifically made for painting, like this little flower type one here and this one here. But otherwise, these are just dishes that I found at a discount store or a thrift store that I already had laying around the house. So that's the great thing about white dishes and using ceramic for painting, is that you can find them anywhere and pretty affordably also. So the ones that are made specifically for painting, like these two palettes that I mentioned here, can be a bit pricier, but if you are getting just like a plate at a thrift store like this one, it'll only cost you a couple dollars. You can also find really creative trays and platters, like this tray here. This is actually a serving dish that I got at World Market, as well as this little tray. I don't even know what this is. It was in the kitchen area, so it's probably for olives or something. And then this here deviled egg platter works perfectly for color mixing. So the drawback, of course, is that it is breakable. You can see in one of these palettes, it actually came cracked when it was shipped to me. And so there's a little area in there where the paint stains because the surface was compromised. But that's not a huge deal. The other nice thing about ceramic palettes is that they are flat. So unlike the butcher tray that we saw earlier that had a little bit of a warp to it, these, like this platter and this little guy here, will stay totally flat. The paint won't bead up. What I like about some of these different palettes is that, in particular, this one has kind of the benefits of the large mixing area of that John Pike plastic palette, but it's got obviously the non-staining surface of ceramic, and I can still get paints wet and kind of drag them down into the mixing area to mix with other paints without getting the original colors very dirty. These palettes here, I was using gouache, which is why it looks a little bit different and why the paint has gotten thicker and cracked there, but that will be able to be reused with just a spritz of water. And then this deviled egg platter, like I said, is perfect for mixing paints. There's 12 wells in it, which is perfect for how I use a 6-color palette when I'm mixing paints, which you can see actually right here. I tend to like to have a bit of a bigger mixing area, so that's why I tend to gravitate towards this palette, keeping this on my desk because I like being able to keep, a few paints here and then having a big area to mix them, which you can't do as much in a palette like this. Now, a final palette surface is disposable, and I haven't personally used these, but you could always use a styrofoam plate in a pinch, or like one of our artists, Andrea Fairservice from the Watercolor Summit, she uses a disposable palette pad, and she can rip off a sheet every time she's done with it and just toss it in the trash. These tend to work better for thicker mediums like gouache, which is what Andrea uses in her workshop. Watercolor probably wouldn't work so well on a disposable palette pad like that. Speaking of Andrea, there's one other palette type that I want to talk about because Andrea uses this type, and it is an Airtight palette that was actually made for paints, and it's got all the separate little wells, and it's not foolproof Airtight. You can see I've had some paints kind of dry up and start to crack in there, but like I said, in the case of this palette here, just a little bit of water will help reactivate that. And if you want to open it up and just spritz it with water every week or so, they will stay moist and ready to use. So this is great for gouache, or if you like to work with your watercolors from a wet state as opposed to dry. Another alternative, if you don't have a palette like this, is to use an ice cube tray. This is what our artist Drew Europeo uses. So you can see it's just a simple ice cube tray, and you can store paints in here as well, whether it's gouache or wet watercolors that you want to stay wet. Keep in mind that with something like this, if you tilt it and you have really full wells of paint, there are areas where the paint could seep through. So this may not be the best option for travel. Something like this would be better because the edges of the wells go all the way up to the top. See if I can show you. And the lid itself has little grooves to match those edges. And here's some final things when considering which of these palettes will work for you. Number one, how do you like to mix paint? Do you like to have a big mixing area like with this one, or are you fine working in a smaller area? Maybe you do more detailed work and work with smaller brushes, not big washes, and maybe this type of palette would be fine for you. Do you like to keep your paints really clean? If you are a more left-brained analytical person like me, it may drive you nuts to work with a metal tin that has half pans that get dirty and it's hard to clean them. Something like this with sloping wells may be more your speed because then you can mix paints without getting the original paint colors dirty. How many colors do you have? I'll explain in a minute how you might be surprised at how few colors you can get away with in your palette while still being able to mix all the colors. Do you need to travel? Is this a palette that you're going to need to be able to toss in a bag or a suitcase and not worry about it getting thrown around? If so, don't go with ceramic, go for one of those folding metal tins or even the plastic one. Is it a permanent palette, or is it just for a specific project? Maybe you just have a few colors that you're going to work with, and you could use something like this, or even one of these to just mix up a handful of colors that you're going to use for a specific project, and it's not your permanent palette. Do you like to work from wet paint or dry paint? All of these options are basically better for dry paint, but if you do like to work from wet watercolors, then you're going to want something that is airtight, like the last palette that I showed. How much room do you have on your desk is another factor. If you don't have a giant desk like this and you only have a small area, you may want to consider getting a smaller palette. Or if you have a ton of room and a dedicated studio, maybe you want to get something big like a big ceramic platter or that big John Pike plastic palette. And last but not least, do you live in a dry climate like the southwest of the US? If so, mixing colors on a flat surface can be a little bit more frustrating because they will dry more quickly. And so something like this that has actual wells that you can mix your colors in will help keep your paints wet longer because they'll kind of concentrate down and fall down to the bottom of that well and stay wet longer. So here's what I wish I knew before investing in all of these palettes: how to mix any color from just a handful of primary colors. And I know it sounds crazy, but it is possible. It took me a long time to figure out how to do it, but once I finally did, I realized that I don't need all the colors that Daniel Smith or Winsor & Newton sells, and I can get away with a limited palette, and it actually helps bring more cohesiveness to my artwork. So if you're fuzzy on color mixing or warm versus cool colors, you should check out my color mixing class, Stop Making Mud. Super affordable, it's only 90 minutes long, and it'll totally change how you see colors. I highly recommend going through that and understanding that before investing in palettes and in paints. So I'll put a link for that below. Leave a comment and let me know which palette you have or if there are any other types that you enjoy using. Thanks so much for watching.